prosperity between the mid-1990s and about 2007, 2008. But in that time, for the people at the bottom across the UK, things have actually consistently got worse. And we are going to see things get almost certainly worse over the next couple of years. In particular, we would expect to see growing levels of homelessness as housing reforms come in. We'd expect to see probably considerable population movements as people are forced to move. We'd expect to see growing levels of employment insecurity as people move into jobs which are less well paid, provide less income, fewer hours and so on. And most dramatically, we are already seeing, and I would expect to extend, greater levels of people who are dependent on emergency support for things like food. We are working with partners on programs that provide emergency food aid in the form of food parcels or hot meals through places like community centres and homeless shelters, and that's increasing exponentially at the moment. And it's being reflected tragically in growing incidents of suicide. That's reported on a high level in Greece already, much lower in the UK, I'm glad to say, but the trend is undoubtedly upwards. What are we trying to do in the UK to address this? And some of these things have been on a long-term pattern, which we recognise we now need to change because of that changing dynamic externally that we are already reacting to, but have got a long way to go. First of all, we are in many ways like a normal Oxfam programme anywhere in the world, in the sense that we try and do two significant things with our programme. We try and run projects to support people in poverty to claim their rights and to build up their livelihoods, and in a sense, as Phil was saying, on a global scale, to actually make change for themselves. And we also work to influence policy on a UK level. But one of the other things we have to do is actually to try and change the nature of the debate around poverty. One of the big differences about being poor in a more developed country is that you are seen as different, you are seen as the other. Jane talked about how that impacts on people in Kenya. It impacts on people in the UK in a very big way as well. It's not just a case of a particular area of the UK isn't important. Particular social groups are seen to lack political power. But those voting levels amongst the poorest people in our society are much lower than those amongst richer groups, and I'm sure you're aware. And that immediately takes people away from having political power, and it means that they can get labelled and classified as undeserving very easily, which immediately allows policymakers and indeed the public to somehow say, well, they deserve it, they shouldn't be supported, or we can make these changes because there won't be any political comeback. And that's one of the major challenges for us, that we work in an environment where taking the concerns of people who are the poorest has become very difficult. And one of our challenges is to work with a range of other organisations and build coalitions to challenge that. Some reflections on what we've been doing over the last year. At the moment, we work with somewhere between 40 and 50 partners. It's changing on a fairly constant basis. Direct support to around 5,000 people, and that's fairly intense support. The wider numbers of people we meet are probably about 6 times that. Very wide range of beneficiaries highlighted on there. There's been a lot of work with migrants and immigrant communities over the last 10 years, but an increasing shift to settled communities facing poverty as well, and work to bring those two groups together and reduce differences between people. And in terms of what we work on, fundamental building blocks, again, not all that different from much work we do elsewhere, around livelihoods, around helping people secure the wherewithal to in a sense, to feed themselves and their families and make themselves actors in their own society, work on gender differences and ensuring that people don't face discrimination because of gender. Again, the majority of our work is with women who statistically face the worst poverty in the UK. But in the challenge of post-industrial society, the situation with men facing poverty is also quite serious, particularly with younger men. So there is some gender work with men. And finally on voice, for the reasons I've already highlighted. Just some geographical picture of how we work. We do have 3 distinct country programmes within the UK, or rather I should say within Great Britain, for Scotland, England and Wales. and the colour code, despite the fact that bits of Wales seem to have invaded Swindon there, it largely reflects that. And I'll talk in a moment about what that means for us. We've done quite a lot of advocacy and campaigning work, and it's fair to say huge amounts of our energy over the last couple of years have been engaged on the welfare reform bill. That is the single action of government that is going to have the biggest impact on the people we work with. Particularly growing insecurity over housing, greater conditionality in securing work-related benefits, and greater challenges to people with disability are all placing a combined downward pressure on income of people at the lowest level, and greater insecurity about where they live and how they live. There are some good things in welfare reform as well, particularly around steps on universal credit, which help people work on a low income and retain benefits at the same time. But at the moment they look significantly outweighed by the deficits. The need to cut the budget significantly has actually made what looked like a logical reform pattern before then actually slip into an austerity measure which has significantly hit the poorest. What we have done is some very interesting and innovative work in the two devolved nations. We've led a major coalition looking at the cuts in Wales, which has had a significant impact on Welsh government policy about how to mitigate the cuts. But perhaps most excitingly globally has been our work on the Humankind Index in Scotland, which we launched at the beginning of April, which is actually looking at measures of well-being, which we're now looking to take forward on a global basis to actually help governments look at what really matters for people other than GDP, which is a very crude measure of actually what makes people happy. Some interesting situations with our funding. I know there were questions being asked about this. Like all other Oxfam programmes, despite the fact the organisation has got to be very prudent with its money at the moment, the programme costs have been protected. We're obviously not the biggest programme, we don't have the greatest level of need, but Oxfam centrally has protected our budget, and we've used that as a basis for wider fundraising. And even in these harder times, we have actually now got the largest budget the UKP has ever seen, which is a considerable achievement, which we're not only proud of, but more importantly allows us to do much more work in a wider range of areas. And the sources of the fundraising are up there. I'm being waved at, so I'm going to finish off fairly quickly. A couple of things that we've learned, I think. First of all, as I iterated at the beginning, we need to make sure that we are communicating more and more convincingly about the realities of poverty in the UK as a challenge arises. And this means that our programme and the way we communicate need to be more linked. We're talking more about the experiences of our partners. There's also implications. As the state, in a sense, pulls back from doing lots of things it's done before, we need to support communities to do more for themselves. That's not necessarily what we would want to see as a first choice, but it's a reality of life for many communities facing poverty in the UK. And what we're going to shift to do that is to do fewer, bigger projects which have bigger impact. We also have ambitions to raise our profile within the debate. We need to make sure that Oxfam's voice is heard more often. The fact that our role as an anti-poverty organisation within the UK is not as widely understood as someone like, for example, the Child Poverty Action Group or Citizens Advice is both a disadvantage, because people say, why are you talking about this, but also an advantage in many ways, because I think Oxfam is bringing that global authoritative voice on poverty to the debate, and that's new and that's different, and that makes people listen. And perhaps the final point I would make, within our world in UKP, the increased political diversity of the UK makes a massive difference, probably more than for any other part of Oxfam, because we face common challenges across the UK in terms of the economic situation and deficit, but our opportunities to influence, our opportunities to make things better do vary hugely between the different countries, and in particular in the devolved nations at the moment, we are making waves, we are seen as major players in the way that we now have to step up and do at the UK level and in England. Thank you very much.